Thank you very much all for coming. We're very lucky to have Rebecca here. Rebecca started off as I think you started off early on in your career. You were a broadcast journalist.
I was.
Rising up to, I think, the head of CNN's Beijing bureau. You're fluent in Mandarin. You've had visiting fellowships and attachments and been on the faculty of various universities, including the Berkman Center at Harvard, Princeton, the University of Hong Kong, and the University of Pennsylvania. But one of her many strings to her career is a long-running interest with the law, the human rights, and the policy of the internet. From a seminal book, The Consent of the Network. When was that published?
2012.
2012.
Yeah.
And even before then with the Global Network Initiative and other organisations. And you've since turned your attention to the problem about how to assess internet and communications companies in terms of their compliance with human rights and norms of privacy and freedom of expression. So I won't witter any more, but I shall hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Richard, and it's an honor to be here in Cambridge, and for Professor Naughton to be here in particular, whose writing that I've admired and wrote a very nice review of my books, so that was very nice. So I'm here today to talk about the Ranking Digital Rights Corporate Accountability Index, which was just released in early November, and we actually have some kind of 4-page summaries at the front of the room, which you're welcome to pick up. Maybe people could even pass around. That gives basic highlights of our findings. The full report is downloadable online at rankingdigitalrights.org. So if you're interested in what we talk about today, I recommend that you go online and download the full report, and you can take a look at all the raw data. And I can, if people are interested in a bit, I can talk a bit more about sort of what's on the website and where you can find things and so on. But to broaden out about what this project is about, and why my colleagues and I, and Richard was involved with various phases of our research as well, for which I'm grateful, and why we did this and what this is about. What human rights is really about at the end of the day is power, the exercise of power, and whether or not power is abused and whether or not it's held accountable. And in the internet age, increasingly power is exercised not just through the physical world, but through our digital lives and through the digital spaces that are mediated and constructed primarily by private enterprise. Internet and mobile devices and sort of the network of digital devices and spaces that make up that space. And so how internet companies, telecommunications companies, how they design their services, what they allow you to do, what you're not allowed to do on those services, who knows what about you, what information is collected, what's shared with whom, that increasingly affects your physical life as we become increasingly dependent on these products and services to not just for education or finding a date, but our politics and everything else. And increasingly our relationships with governments are also mediated through these services. One of the companies that we look at in the index is a Korean company, and Korea actually happens to have been the first country where a president was elected thanks to online organizing. That's a piece of trivia for you. It was not the United States, it was not some other place in the West, but it was in Korea. And so increasingly now, I think many political candidates are dependent on Facebook for their political success, among other platforms. And so this relationship goes in many different directions, of course. Thanks to Edward Snowden, we know more than we ever did about the way in which governments can find out a lot about what we are doing through these networks, both our telecommunication services and the internet services that we're using. So it's absolutely vital that not only that governments be committed to protecting our human rights, but that companies be committed to respecting our human rights. Because if the companies that are basically governing our digital lives, sort of in conjunction with governments that regulate those companies, if they do not have a core commitment to your freedom of expression, to your privacy, to your rights, then these technologies and this digital world will not be serving people. It'll be serving the companies and the governments whose interests are pursued on those networks. So that's what this index fundamentally is about. It's about our companies, to what extent are companies demonstrating a commitment to respect our rights to freedom of expression and privacy. So what did we do exactly? We examined 16 companies, 8 internet companies and 8 telecommunications companies. These are the internet companies. Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, Twitter, and Facebook are services that people all over the world are using. But we also wanted to look at some companies that are headquartered elsewhere, not just in the United States, and that have powerful influence over internet users, perhaps less so in the West, but certainly in Asia. Tencent, the Chinese internet company, is a very large social network. It runs a chat client called WeChat that's actually used not only in China, but increasingly around the developing world and also increasingly in the West. Mail.ru owns not only an email and chat service, but also Vkontakte, which is Russia's quote-unquote Facebook. And so, again, in the Russian-speaking world, Mail.ru is very powerful over people's lives. And Kakao, the Korean company that I mentioned, is heavily used not just in Korea, but their chat services in particular are used around Asia. And so we wanted to be able to have a comparative perspective on internet companies, not only based in the United States, but also in some other places. We then also selected 8 telecommunications companies based on a combination of factors. One had to do with size and the number of users, but also their global reach, and we wanted to go for a distribution of companies that are basically important to people in different parts of the world. So, for instance, MTN, based in South Africa, has operations all over Africa and the Middle East. Etisalat also all around the Middle East and the developing world. Bharti Airtel in India operates not only in South Asia, but all over Africa. Axiata in Malaysia is around Southeast Asia. Orange, based in France, is all over the Middle East and Africa. Vodafone is also heavily operating around the developing world. And AT&T is primarily in the United States, but moving into Latin America. América Móvil is one of the 2 dominant carriers all over Latin America, based in Mexico. So we wanted to have a distribution of the world's, basically by choosing these 8 internet companies and 8 telecommunications companies, a combination of companies that collectively are shaping the digital lives of literally billions, well over 1 billion people on the planet. So this is a screenshot of the first page on the website of the index. It's also reproduced in this pamphlet. It's probably a little bit easier to read in the pamphlet, but I'll explain a little bit what you're seeing. We evaluated these companies on 31 different indicators that are divided into 3 different categories. One is what we call the commitment category, and I'll explain a little bit later what that entailed. One is freedom of expression, so policies and practices of the companies that are affecting your access to information and also your ability to speak and act online. Privacy, who knows what about you and what's being collected about you and with whom it's being shared and who can access it, etc. And we were looking at disclosed policies and practices. So We were looking at what are the company's public commitments, and then what do they disclose about their actual policies and practices to implement those commitments. And I'll give some examples about sort of what that entailed as we kind of dive down into the results a bit more. As you'll see, the scores were not particularly good. While Google's sort of level of commitment and disclosure happened to be higher than the other companies, it's still, you know, basically on an American academic scale at any rate, it got a D or an F, and everybody else is down from there. So, and as you'll see when we dig into the data, even the companies that got high scores overall on specific indicators did rather shockingly poorly. So you know, I'll show you some examples of that. Quite a lot of companies, 7 companies, which is nearly half, scored under 30% of the total possible points, and in fact were between 13 and 22%. And so 30% is what we considered the cutoff for does the company display some just baseline level of effort in at least some areas, and companies below that were really found to be making very, very minimal or sort of lacking any concerted effort. So that's kind of the overarching picture. And again, we'll drill down on that, and you can go on the website and look at every single indicator and download the raw data and everything else. So one of the general kind of points here is that there are no winners, that while some companies do make some commitments, that users of these technologies are left in the dark about when it comes to having a basic understanding about how these companies' operations and practices actually affect their freedom of expression and privacy. That there are huge gaps of information that prevent us from understanding the connection between what these companies are doing and our ability to exercise our rights online. So I'm going to start with the privacy category because that's, I know, of great interest to many people. There's a lot of debate around surveillance going on in the UK these days, a lot of debate in Europe about commercial data protection. And the top score on the privacy category was lower than the overall score for the index as a whole, and you'll see that there are a number of companies that are sort of bunched up towards the top. What does the privacy category look at? It looks at everything from, does the company actually publish its privacy policies? You'd be surprised. Some companies don't make them accessible to non-customers or non-subscribers. Is there notification when the privacy policy changes to users? Then there's a section on basically what is often called commercial data protection. So is the company clear with users? Does it communicate clearly about what user information is collected, how long it's retained, with whom it's shared, under what circumstances, what third-party information is collected from other sites, also about the user, and then a set of questions around what is coming to be called transparency reporting. So is the company disclosing some basic information about its policies to handle third-party requests for user information? So when a government or another entity requests user information, does the company explain how it handles those requests? Does it publish data about the number of requests it's receiving and the percentage that it's responding to? And also we have a set of questions about security practices and to what extent is the company giving us some basic information about whether they are making best efforts to secure our data. So that's kind of the privacy policy overall, and you can see this is how it played out for the entire category. But when you drill down to specific questions, things shift around quite dramatically. So for instance, if you take this indicator, which we called P3, does the company disclose what user information it collects, how it collects this information, and why? The company with the highest score was Kakao, a Korean company. Facebook actually came in second with the greatest disclosure about what it's doing. It's, of course, collecting a lot of information, but they have been pressured by a lot of people over time to disclose more about what they collect. Then there's sort of a whole random group of companies that all get the same score for different reasons in terms of how they're disclosing information, and then it sort of goes down from there. And so you'll see that while Google is at the top of the overall category on this particular indicator, it's much more mediocre. When we get into some other indicators, for instance, the question, does the company disclose if and how it shares user information with third parties? Kakao, again, was slightly higher than everyone else, followed by Yahoo, and Google is way down towards the bottom in terms of its disclosure of if and how it shares your information with third parties. Now, we were also, and this is on the website and in the report, we had a very clear definition of what user information means. And our definition is not the same as all companies. User information includes any information that can be used to identify you, even if it's not your name and address, but it might be the IP address from which you were connecting to the service. It might be location data. So metadata we can consider user information because it can be used to construct a profile of a person and their activities. So some companies lost a lot of points because they disclose information about how they handle your name and your address, but they don't disclose information about what they do with your metadata particularly, or they're very unclear about what information they're telling you about and what they're not. So part of this is really trying to push companies to clarify what it is they're doing. And as you'll see, quite interestingly, one of the interesting things we've observed, now we didn't have a huge sample of European companies in the study, but what was interesting is that the two EU-based companies that were in the index, sort of contrary to what I think a lot of people expected, did not score on the top when it comes to disclosure to users about what they share with third party. And it may well be that, I think let's be charitable and assume they're complying with data protection law in the EU, but they're not disclosing to users what they're doing particularly. So if the user is a telecommunications lawyer and really understands about EU data protection law and understands that these companies are compliant, they might be able to figure this out. But in terms of disclosing in clear language to a user who is not a telecommunications lawyer, the information is much less actually than some of these other companies. So that's an interesting, I think, observation. And another observation is that I circled these other two companies, MTN and Bharti Airtel from South Africa and India. And these are both democracies, and they could be doing better. There's no reason they couldn't be disclosing more. And so this is another area where I think some NGOs in those countries are starting to ask some questions. And the response from these companies is, well, the regulators aren't making us disclose the information, so we didn't bother. That's privately the response. It's not publicly, they have no response. So there's this question of, should companies be expected to proactively do more than what the regulator has gotten around to requiring, or should we just wait until South Africa and India pass and start to enforce data protection laws before companies start to actually disclose to users what they're collecting. And so that's kind of an interesting question for students of law, I suppose. Do we have to wait for law to be passed, or should we be expecting companies to proactively behave responsibly when it comes to disclosing basic policies and practices? And moving on to the freedom of expression category. So what were we looking at here? We were looking at policies and practices of companies that may lead to restrictions on what you can view or access. So right here we have a screenshot. I think Richard will recognize this one. We have a screenshot from the Vodafone mobile service taken when someone tried to access some content that was being blocked by Vodafone on its network. The other screenshot is from Twitter, a message that appeared when someone based in Germany tried to access a tweet that Twitter had restricted to German users because the German government had notified Twitter that that content was illegal under German law, so Twitter had restricted that. So these are just examples of how companies sometimes restrict speech, either in response to law or in enforcement of terms of service or other things, and some of the ways in which freedom of expression can be restricted. Also, companies might deactivate an account. They might have policies against certain types of speech that are just their own terms of service and restrict either accounts or suspend accounts or take down photos and so on. So those are all the different, or their identity policies might affect how you can speak online or whether you can use the service. So here is the overall freedom of expression category. Google came up first because they have more disclosure about what's happening, how they're managing speech on their platform. Kakao came in slightly ahead of Twitter for second and third, and then we went from there. But what's interesting is again, when you get into the specific questions, so you take, for instance, our indicator F6, process for responding to third-party requests. So this is asking, does the company publish information about its process for evaluating and responding to requests that they receive either from governments or from third parties to restrict content or service? So if a government says you have to take this down, or you have to deactivate so-and-so's account, or if a child protection organization, an NGO, calls up the company and says you have to restrict this and that because it's bad, or just whatever kinds of requests that the company entertains, does it disclose how it handles those requests and what requests it does actually entertain and what types of requests it doesn't? And so we have a group of companies that do disclose. Vodafone actually discloses more information than everybody else on this, kind of followed closely by Google. We have a lot of companies that disclose nothing about this. And again, a lot of these countries where these companies are headquartered don't necessarily have laws that would prevent them from disclosing some basic information about their policies, but they are not doing so at present. Then we kind of drill down into, again, what we call transparency reporting. And does the company, so with this indicator F7, does the company regularly publish data about government requests, including judicial orders to remove, filter, or restrict content or access to service? So in other words, when they're getting government or court requests to take down content, restrict an account, are they publishing any data about the number of requests they're receiving? We only had in the index 6 of the 16 companies publish any data at all about requests that they're getting to remove content. Interestingly, just flagging, the 2 European companies are not doing any transparency reporting on this. And maybe Richard can talk a little bit about the legal context and why they are not. I mean, there's a lot more clear reasons why they're not reporting on requests for user data, but in terms of requests to remove content, it seems like there's a lot more dispute about really whether there's a legitimate argument that they can't disclose anything. And then when you get into other kinds of requests, so if you get into transparency around private requests, so this is not government requests, but a lot of private organizations request that companies take down content. Companies have their own reporting mechanisms so that users can flag content and request that it be taken down. Only 4 of the companies we looked at publish any data about the number of private requests they receive or the number that they're responding to. So there's very, very little transparency in this area. And particularly at a time when there's more and more pressure on companies to deal with hate speech and to deal with a lot of speech that none of us like. And one can have a long conversation about the extent to which companies should be policing speech. But assuming that they do, and assuming that they have rules, to what extent are they being transparent with us and accountable with us about how those rules get enforced and whose requests they are responding to? Very little transparency. And very interestingly, Kakao is more transparent than anybody else. In terms of service enforcement, so what is the volume of content being taken down by companies themselves of their own volition to enforce their terms of service? So let's take an example, actually a rather extreme example of terms of service enforcement that has been going on recently. So Twitter has been under a lot of pressure. Its terms of service says that groups that support terrorism are not allowed on Twitter. And they've been under pressure from governments to enforce that rule very heavily. So women named ISIS on Twitter are all having their accounts taken down. So that's an example of terms of service enforcement, a more extreme one. But Twitter's kind of doing this of its own volition because it feels like it needs to carry out enforcement, but it's doing so in a pretty heavy-handed way. There's no data about the volume and also the content, the nature of the content that's being removed or restricted in enforcement of terms of service. And so the question is this acceptable? That it's a complete black box when increasingly this has such an impact on people's communications. So then coming on to the next category, the commitment category, which was actually the first category in the index, and the broader category, which has to do with companies' overall commitments. And that category is drawing heavily from what we call or what is called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which sets forth a framework that while governments have the primary duty to protect our human rights, companies have a responsibility to respect our rights, and both jointly have a responsibility to provide meaningful remedy. So that when rights are violated in connection with a company's business, people have avenues, both legal and through private channels, to file grievances and to have those grievances addressed and have sort of problematic actions reversed when possible, etc. And commitment also deals in this instance, the UN Guiding Principles are very put a lot of emphasis on companies assessing what their risks are. So carrying out what we call human rights impact assessments, which in context of freedom of expression and privacy is that a company needs to assess what are the threats to its users' freedom of expression and privacy in connection with its own business. And perhaps what are the opportunities for expanding both of those. But a company needs to actually examine what its risks are, anticipate them, and seek to mitigate harms. So in terms of commitment, what's very, very interesting is that the companies that scored best on commitment, so not only making policy statements, but showing evidence that they're carrying out those policies in a meaningful way, both with training, with whistleblowing mechanisms inside the company, stakeholder engagement, and so on. The companies that scored at the top of that were members either of the Global Network Initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder organization, and Bennett Freeman, sitting here in the back, is one of the founding members of that. When he was sort of from an investor point of view, but this is an organization that brings together academics, investors, human rights groups, and companies, gets the companies to sign on to some core commitments around freedom of expression and privacy, and then actually assesses the companies to verify whether they're meaningfully carrying out their commitments. And the GNI mainly deals with how companies handle government requests, but nonetheless it's requiring a framework of due diligence that seems to be having an impact based on what we've been seeing as we kind of dug through the indicators to look at specific practices. The other higher scoring companies in this category are members of something called the Telecommunications Industry Dialogue, which is a group of telecommunications companies that have come together and signed on to some principles that are basically telecommunications industry adaptations of the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. They don't get independently assessed. They're not working with human rights groups as directly as in the Global Network Initiative, but nonetheless, they're at least making commitments and making some commitments to also implement those commitments. And so we did see more evidence of implementation for those companies. So one thing that was interesting is, you take Orange there. Orange didn't actually score so well in the privacy and freedom of expression categories in terms of their specific policies and practices around those particular rights when it comes to communicating to users. But on commitment, it did score pretty well. So they carry out human rights impact assessment and so on. So it's kind of interesting to think about the connection between implementation at different levels and what is more meaningful and why. And I think that's an interesting area of future study for many people. Drilling down into specific indicators in this category, the indicator looking at human rights impact assessment, then we had a number of sub-questions within the indicator just looking at specifically what does their assessment cover. And you can go, and I won't go through the whole thing. I could do an entire lecture just on this indicator, but it's all on the website and in the report in terms of all the sub-questions we looked at. But interestingly, Yahoo discloses the most thorough information about its human rights impact assessment, and one of the companies, surprisingly, that has made a lot of statements about respecting users' rights and defending users' rights, but doesn't carry out human rights impact assessments is Twitter. And Twitter scored fairly poorly in the commitment category as a whole, in part because while specific executives make statements about human rights of users and some of their practices around freedom of expression and privacy, and particularly their transparency reporting, is quite good, and they push back against government requests in certain ways, they do not provide any evidence that they're actually institutionalizing their commitments. So they have no evidence of doing employee training around freedom of expression and privacy, no evidence of human rights impact assessment, no evidence of grievance mechanism, or very few grievance mechanisms, no evidence of whistleblowing within the company, and so on. So they ended up doing pretty poorly in the category overall, and they got a 0 for human rights impact assessment. Another really interesting indicator in this category was our indicator on remedy, which has to do with, do users have a mechanism to file grievances if they feel that their rights have been violated? So if their content was taken down, unjustly, in their view. So if your name is ISIS and you got your account deactivated, do you have a way to file grievance? But there's sort of a range of different types of grievances you might have. And does the company have a clear mechanism for addressing those grievances? And is it showing evidence that it's actually taking those problems on board and making institutional changes as it learns from the grievances. Those are the types of questions we ask in that indicator. And interestingly, the companies that do better on this are not the G&I member companies or the telecommunications industry dialogue companies particularly, but the telco that does best on this is an Indian company, mainly because Indian law requires grievance officers. And the best internet company in grievance by just a little bit is Kakao, also having to do with regulatory requirements, although everybody's doing pretty bad on grievance. And so this speaks to an issue, I think, again, particularly as governments are placing more and more demands on intermediaries such as these to solve more and more of our social and public security problems. And as these companies are trying to enforce a growing number of rules, if there's no grievance mechanism that really works, what does that mean? And so one of the takeaways I'm taking from our research is that it's vital that the industry figure out how to do proper grievance and remedy, and that's very, very important as we go forward. So in addition to grievance, which I've already mentioned, the recommendations we're making to companies are that we really do need to see thorough evidence of risk assessment going on. We need to see transparency not only around government requests, but about private requests, terms of service enforcement, what's happening more broadly. We need companies to communicate clearly about what's happening to their users' information. If somebody was to create a dossier on you based on your use of Google and Facebook and Vodafone, is it possible for you to actually construct a picture of what that dossier would look like? You know, and if not every piece of information in it, you would at least know what are all the categories of information that company has on you, so that you can then make your own informed choices about whether you really want to be using the service in that manner. And companies need to be giving people more choice about what they share and what they don't, particularly when it comes to information that isn't essential to the operating of the service itself. And so we also look at that. But this is vital to push this forward. And of course, strong security practices. That's, I think, in this day and age, absolutely essential. That companies be showing evidence that they're making maximum efforts to keep our data secure. We also have recommendations for governments, because there are quite a number of companies in the index whose performance was hindered substantially because of regulation that is not enabling them to be transparent. There are a lot of laws, not only around surveillance, but around, but around speech, that are quite ambiguous about what companies can actually reveal in terms of how they're responding to government demands or even private demands. We need the laws to enable maximum transparency unless there's a real threat to individuals, and for these laws to be better tailored. Governments themselves also need to be transparent and accountable about the requests they're making of companies. And I would say also about the types of functions they're pushing off to private organizations to police content and activity as well. That again, we need to understand how these controls are happening. There's too much opacity and obscurity, which means that if mechanisms are abused or if they're just badly managed, we don't know who to hold responsible or accountable for that. So that's all for what I have to say. I know that I'll sort of let Richard, you sort of lead the way in terms of sort of maybe if there are sort of broader conversations we want to have. But one of the sets of questions that we often get, particularly in audiences that aren't business audiences, is why do a ranking at all? Why use this particular type of tool? And the reason is and Bennett Freeman back here can perhaps speak to that a little bit, is that in the field of business and human rights, and in the field of, more broadly, of corporate social responsibility and sustainability, we've seen the use of rankings as an actually fairly effective tool in getting companies to change. And while there are a lot of faults with this kind of approach, and Richard and I have talked about this, that we're only looking at publicly available information. We're only looking at what companies are disclosing. There's a lot of things companies might be doing in secret that we're not tracking here. Nonetheless, we're saying this is sort of a baseline that, if a company is doing well in our index, it doesn't mean that they're great. It just means that they're meeting a basic minimum threshold of disclosure and commitment, and then there needs to be other research done on top of that to verify whether they're lying, for instance. But at least you get the disclosure that people can then measure against and verify. But other rankings on other issues, be it sort of labor practices or sustainability or access to medicines, conflict minerals, have seen companies sort of trying to compete and starting to improve their practices. And I don't know if Bennett, if you feel like commenting or waiting for questions.
What I think might make more sense is to have a
Q&A.
broader conversation, and maybe in 15 or 20 minutes.
Sure, we can pull you in.
Pull me in, and I can put
Sounds
this
good.
in a broader perspective. But after others have asked
Very
questions
good.
and made comments, I'd be happy to do it that way.
Great.
Thanks.
Can I ask a question before we open it up? Which is the one my wife asked me this morning. Which she asked me, and it's the ISIS question.
Yeah.
She asked me, why am I so bothered about government privacy against the government, given terrorist attacks? And why am I so bothered about transparency? Surely, if we start reporting everything, then that gives help to the people who wish us harm.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent is that a challenge to the project?
Right. So we're not sort of taking an extreme view either on privacy or on freedom of expression. We're not saying that companies should not be sharing any information with governments, and companies that share nothing with governments get the highest score. That's not actually how this is constructed. Nor is it constructed that companies that let people do anything they want and have no rules score higher. That's also not how this is constructed. This is based on the assumption that the right to freedom of expression, the right to privacy exist in the context of other rights, and that these rights are sometimes in competition with one another. Your right to security, your right to life being among them. So the issue is more about accountability in terms of, if you want to actually be a society where human rights are not abused, if you want to be a society, if you want to not be North Korea, you need to have some accountability going on. So you can say, okay, I trust that the government is never going to do anything wrong, and that I'm just going to leave them to fight ISIS and leave them to work with companies and allow it to be a black box. There are people in society who feel that's acceptable. But I think history has shown that often goes badly wrong when those who are doing the surveillance and fighting the crime have no accountability mechanisms, and nobody ever being able to find out when they abuse their power, and sort of no sense of the scope of this enforcement that's taking place. So what this is about is to have some basic accountability and transparency about the circumstances, first of all, the circumstances under which your information is being collected commercially by these companies, which wasn't, Google's collecting its information not on GCHQ's request, but because it wants to do its business and provide you with services, but then, it gets requested, right? So then, so first of all, you want to know what's being collected on you and who it's being shared with, under what circumstances, and then who can act, what government entities are requesting it, and what are the safeguards. Because we now know, thanks to Snowden and others, that this gets abused. And so, yeah, we want ISIS to be fought, but do I want my personal photos being passed around the NHA for giggles and shits? Which we know happens or has happened in the past. Again, are there proper safeguards against abuse of these powers? And will anybody ever, if you give powers sort of in combination to companies and governments, and there's no way for anybody to identify abuse, human history shows in what country, under what circumstance has abuse not happened? Right. So that's very important. Around freedom of expression, yeah, again, there's an expectation that companies will be enforcing rules. I wouldn't be able to use social media myself if they completely allowed people to, issue death threats against me every day, So there are obviously, I think, parameters that we all agree are acceptable and necessary, and there's debate amongst different societies about where that line should be, and different internet platforms put those lines in different places, and that's fine. The point is that if a company has rules that are different from the law, which they often do, often these companies have rules that are more restrictive than the actual law is. First of all, we need to know what they are. We need to have a clear understanding of how the company is actually interpreting those rules, and we need to have an understanding of how they're being enforced. And we need to have a mechanism to appeal when those rules when the enforcement is being done very badly. And women named ISIS. There's this woman who's like a computer programmer in Silicon Valley, and she got kicked off of Twitter because her name is ISIS. And that's is your wife okay with that? Just leaving it to Twitter to figure it out on their own and having no consequence when mistakes are made. So that's the thing. So it's not an absolutist stance, but rather it's saying, given that there's so much pressure on companies to govern activities and to work with governments, on a set of things that society actually wants them to do, how do we ensure enough transparency and accountability and sort of, checks and balances, as it were, to ensure that it doesn't turn into a huge black box, that power isn't being exercised behind sort of a private curtain that we can't see and that we can't hold accountable.
Thank you. There's lots of questions all over the place. I saw you momentarily before I saw.
Thanks. Oh, do you want to leave? Did you want to go first?
I was going to apologise that I have to leave. Can I do a quick one? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
it was
please, no
fascinating.
problem.
I'd love to stay. But I just wanted to ask about the relationship between the commitment and the other ones. You touched on it a bit.
Sure.
And it is striking. There's a broad correlation. But in some cases, so
Right.
you touched on most strikingly Twitter and Facebook. High scores on commitment for Facebook go with low scores on those. And you say you measure commitment not just by pretty words, but by follow-through. But do you have any sense that commitment can sometimes be a substitute for action rather than... Because certainly in some of these cases, it does look more like window dressing.
Right.
And even if it's not just words, but a commitment to process. And as you say, it's the people who signed up to the agreement who do well on the commitment score.
Right.
But that's not necessarily following...
It's harder to tell
measures.
what's happening on the other measures.
Yeah. So do you have a sense yet of where, or even how you would know when it's commitment, it's good commitment?
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's I think a really key question. And that's certainly why we wouldn't want to do the ranking entirely on commitment. There are indicators within commitment that try to get to, shall we say, go beyond words. And so within the Human Rights Impact Assessment Indicator, for instance, if in order to get a full score, you have to have actually been independently assessed that what you're doing is meaningful. We had debated whether that indicator should be weighted more heavily. We ended up deciding not to weight indicators differently just because nobody agrees on what's more important than what. So in that sense, that kind of speaks to the nature of rankings where you're sort of making decisions about kind of what goes into one indicator and then that affects the score, and which is why it's really important to kind of drill down as you're doing on specific questions and trying to say, how meaningful is this particular score for this indicator versus another one in terms of pretty words versus actual deeds. But human rights impact assessments, if they're done properly, and if we can verify that they're being done properly, are one of those tools where a company is also kind of identifying risks to users and then kind of plowing that information back into its business decisions to avoid harm. So if a company is kind of using that tool correctly, that can actually get to things that we weren't able to cover in the freedom of expression and privacy category, which are entirely dependent on what the company chooses to disclose. And in both of those categories, in our conversations with companies, some companies say there's actually a bunch of stuff we're doing to protect the privacy of our users that we won't disclose, because if we disclose it, we can't do it anymore. Because governments will go after us, or ways in which companies are sort of fudging the law a little bit in users' favor, particularly in certain jurisdictions where the law tends to violate freedom of expression and privacy, sort of well beyond what kind of human rights standards would allow. And they're just like, we're not going to disclose what we're up to there because, it would actually not be in the interest of human rights. And so those types of things don't end up showing up in the freedom of expression and privacy category because they're not the kinds of things that you actually want them to be disclosing. But those kinds of things are something of a result of a good human rights impact assessment where the company decides, okay, in our Vietnam operations, we're kind of fudge things a little bit and kind of interpret this law a little bit vaguely and stick the server in Singapore and, kind of do this and that to kind of protect our users, but not be very public about it. And so a good human rights impact assessment process would kind of help a company to make those decisions and kind of implement processes that are less visible. So in that sense, there are parts of the commitment section, also, for instance, stakeholder engagement and meaningful stakeholder engagement, and actually then kind of using what you learn through stakeholder engagement to help you make your decisions about design, about your business practices. That also, I think, that's another type of thing in the commitment section that ends up touching upon practices that might not be found in the other categories. So in that sense, the commitment section does have a bit more in it than just kind of pretty words, or whether you have a whistleblowing program, whether you have training of employees that's meaningful, whether you have board oversight over freedom of expression and privacy, so evidence that there's a real chain of responsibility and that top management's taking it seriously. So it is more than words, but this is why I think we sort of need to look at these things in combination. But it's also the case that, in terms of assigning a score, it's a little bit artificial. And, that's why I think a lot of academics kind of point to rankings and say, well, these scores are somewhat arbitrary. In a way, it's sort of an attention-getting device to get companies' minds to focus because they got a score, and so then they'll do something. But actually, we found even in our conversations with companies that they're much more interested in their scores on individual indicators than they are in their overall score. Their overall score doesn't sort of mean that much. They're really looking at how they did on particular sub-indicators for specific services and then kind of what they ought to change. So
just very briefly,
yeah.
The blunt question,
sure.
which of those models does your instinct tell you Facebook falls? I mean, Is Facebook scoring well on commitment because it's doing good things on the others that we don't know about? Or does it score well on commitment because it's worked out ways to
Right.
signal commitment?
So Facebook scores relatively well on commitment because it's made some commitments. It's starting to do impact assessment. It scores on the other categories. Actually, it's pretty interesting. It's worth drilling down in the report. So we have company profiles of each company, and we go through why their scores were the way they were. And Facebook actually is very uneven. So we looked at the corporate entity. So our evaluation of Facebook wasn't just the Facebook service itself, but also Instagram and WhatsApp, which they own. And WhatsApp is 900 million users, so that's non-trivial as far as human rights are concerned. And Instagram is heavily used around the world. Their policies and practices for the Facebook service much stronger than Instagram and WhatsApp. So actually their practices with those two other services drag down the corporate entity as a whole. And so what may happen, a sort of low-hanging fruit outcome of this index would be that Facebook gets its act together with Instagram and WhatsApp. And that would probably push up their score fairly significantly if they do that. But yeah, it's so this is where kind of all the little details about a company's score varies from company to company depending on what's going on. Thank you. Good questions.
Thanks very much again for the talk. It's a really interesting project, very promising one. As a civil libertarian, thinking inside the law box
Right.
of this, I'm hoping that for the vision for this, that there will be a greater focus on convincing the government as to how important these, and when I say the government, I mean all governments.
Exactly.
As to how important these findings are. Because in terms of real change, in terms of when companies have really been put in uncomfortable places in the past couple of years, it's been through judicial review in Europe. The Google Spain judgment, Belgian versus Facebook recently. Like they have been the times when there's no window dressing, you haven't complied with the law, here's now is what's going to happen, or there are going to be significant financial sanctions.
Right.
So in terms of ensuring that work like this has its fullest impact, what would your plans be in terms of I'm trying to give practical examples, but meeting with relevant departments, Department of Justice, data protection authorities across the world, but also contacting courts, providing judicial training, convincing judges that human rights impact assessments, these rankings are quite significant and play a very large role in investigating compliance of these companies, because the governments don't have the resources to carry out such detailed assessments. So I was just wondering what your plans might be. Great question.
Definitely one of the things we're hoping to do, and we're still sort of working on our resources for the coming year, as many nonprofits are often doing. But there's definitely a set of recommendations for governments here. And I think one of the real findings is a set of ways in which governments are preventing companies from respecting users' rights, and things that governments should be doing differently to enable maximum respect for users' rights. And I think that our findings kind of have helped to highlight some of that. And so, interestingly, I was at the Internet Governance Forum last week in Brazil, and there were a lot of people from a number of governments there. It's a UN forum that happens once a year. And there were several governments, plus someone from the European Commission, plus, a UN special rapporteur, who are very interested in having more conversations because, for exactly the reason you note, that this is as much about the interplay between governments and companies as it is about companies. And actually, Richard worked with us on a kind of a related project before we put out the index, a report for UNESCO. And one of the recommendations we made in that report is that governments, upon passing a law or revising a law, or sort of interpreting law, there needs to be an assessment of to what extent is this government action, be it a law or a regulation, going to be compatible with the company's ability to respect freedom of expression and privacy. So, be it copyright law or, intermediary liability or any number of other kind of related requirements that are placed on companies to solve problems that society wants to address via these intermediaries. How are we making sure that the solution is not preventing companies from just basic respect for users' rights, or even just being transparent about what they're doing? So that's one of the things that we're calling for, and definitely, around some of our freedom of expression findings and the fact that there's so little disclosure about terms of service enforcement, and so little disclosure about private requests, and so little disclosure about government requests to remove content. And you have so much pressure, particularly in Europe, for companies to police content in any number of ways. There's got to be transparency. I mean, if this is the route that Europe is going to insist on going down, there's got to be a transparency and accountability mechanisms built in on all sides, and grievance and remedy. And without that, the chances of abuse and the chances of grave mistakes happening for freedom of expression are, perhaps, to be assumed to be very high. But how do we get that conversation going, I think, is definitely a challenge. And, and again, around surveillance, more and more surveillance laws are being passed. Can we at least get some basic transparency and accountability going on, not only on the government side, but enable companies to report to the greatest extent possible on what's happening, what they're responding to, and how. Again, otherwise it's sort of a black box behind which, nobody knows what's happening. So there's a lot of conversations to be had. We're a very small project, so, we don't have a lot of resources to kind of run around. But the good news is that we're trying to collaborate with everybody. So the idea is that, academics in the UK and NGOs in the UK, in Europe, in India, we're talking to some groups in India, both academics and NGOs, in Latin America and so on, can kind of take our findings and kind of localize their conversations and say, okay, I'm in Brazil, and based on what Ranking Digital Rights kind of observed, here's the conversations I want to have with Brazilian regulators, because, the local groups or the local academics understand those regulators better than I certainly do. Or in the UK, what are the ways, who are the groups or individuals or academics or whoever who might be interested in kind of taking what we've done and translating it into the right policy conversations. Again, that's something we really welcome. That sort of a collaborative approach to trying to have those policy discussions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello. Sure. Thank you very much. I'm really intrigued by this as an advocacy tool. Mm-hmm. And I apologize about being late, and I hope I'm teaching, and you may have covered this already, but if not, I'd love to know the answer. which is that thinking about how I know that this ranking is based on what's disclosed, but in the process of your research, I was wondering if you have insights into how these discussions happen within company walls, especially the voluntary aspects. Is it because there's a sort of an ally who's particularly taken by these notions, who then fights for it within the company, or are there sort of teams established, or how is it discussed and then institutionalized within their walls?
That's a really good question. And after I answer it, I know that Bennett's sort of interested in talking about that too, because this is something that perhaps more than through the research on the ranking, although somewhat, because we did have conversations with roughly half the companies in the ranking. But before that, through this, both Bennett and I are members of something called the Global Network Initiative. I through kind of the academic kind of constituency, and Bennett through the investor constituency. We've been having conversations with companies for quite some years now about what they need to be committing to, kind of initially working with companies on, okay, what are the principles that you can publicly commit to? And then what are the set of operational guidelines for how a company goes about adhering to those commitments? And then how do you sort of assess and govern what the companies are doing? And so we've managed to have, a lot of conversations with people who work in companies who don't tend to have these conversations in public, just about kind of the inner workings of what's going on. And it does vary a lot from company to company, but you definitely get kind of internal champions, people who are, so some companies now, for instance, the Yahoo now has a human rights and business and human rights program within the company to basically serve as an umbrella group to help different parts of the company kind of both assess and then address freedom of expression and privacy challenges. And so the people who are hired to run that, of course, have expertise in these issues, care passionately about these issues, want everybody else in the company to care about it, probably sometimes fight with the advertising and marketing and other engineers and whatnot about what the company should be doing on particular things. And so Microsoft has kind of set up a group that's also dealing with these things. So you definitely get people within the companies that are concerned. There have also been, especially with the U.S. internet companies, there was kind of a seminal moment almost 10 years, or basically 10 years ago now, when several companies got a lot of very bad PR over their business in China and the compromises they were making in China. And several companies were sort of called into Congress and yelled at and called moral pygmies, and were threatened with lots of sort of weird regulation if they didn't start to show more commitment. But there were some people within the companies who were like, look, we're really trying to do the right thing here, and we kind of screwed up. But when you talk to them honestly, so for instance, the people at Yahoo, they don't say this publicly in public speeches, but Yahoo got in trouble because they ended up in a position where they were running an email service inside China, which meant that when the police asked for user information, they had to hand it over, or their employees would go to jail. So dissidents and investigative journalists who were reporting things the government didn't want them to report ended up getting caught up in this. And people in the company sort of admitted privately that they hadn't thought through the implications of doing this. That at the time they went into China, they were just kind of so in love with the idea of bringing the internet to China, and that the details didn't matter because you bring the internet to China and it'll be free. Kind of 10, 15 years ago, that was sort of the myth about the internet in a lot of societies. So a lot of companies were not thinking through the finer details too much about implications for individual users in specific scenarios. And a lot of companies have learned a lot. Actually, Yahoo held a meeting a few years ago for startups in Silicon Valley to kind of introduce them to some of the challenges that they wish they had not had to learn the hard way, and brought in some human rights experts and so on and it was very interesting that some of these people from the startups had really not thought through some basic challenges because they were so interested in just getting their business out there. But what's interesting too is that this is not only sort of an issue for internet companies, but you see this in a lot of different industries. And Bennett, who's as an investor and as a human rights advocate, has dealt with the likes of Coca-Cola and BP and lots of other companies. Has also kind of seen this dynamic going on in a lot of different industries. I don't know, Bennett, if you want to comment.
I'm happy to just address that just
Yeah.
quickly here. First, to answer to give another dimension to your very good question. On one level, these companies, the ones that Rebecca has looked at, particularly the American ones, for that matter, the European ones, are highly complex organizations and that maintain a facade of coherence and unity at the top macro corporate level. But below the surface, there are different functions within the company. There are different and often competing, or if not competing, at least not always perfectly aligned interests. And there are some functions and individuals who may have an interest in seeing external forces or players push them in some ways that they may find helpful. I've run into this phenomenon for 15 years now, and the work I've done with the oil and mining industry, food and beverage, footwear and apparel, as well as with this industry. I've often run in, for example, in my work as a responsible investor, I recently led the biggest so-called ethical investment platform in the US, that sometimes the corporate responsibility types, even at a very senior level, would privately welcome or even encourage the shareholder resolution on a particular issue because it can help be a sort of a catalyst for accelerating the discussion internally in a certain direction, even if the optics or politics of the resolution were uncomfortable or challenging for others in other organizations. You can't underestimate the different interests in these companies. You've got the legal and the compliance people. You've got the public relations, communications, public affairs people. The government relations people, whether it's state, federal, in the US context, national, international level. You've got the operational people in the field, and you've got the investor relations folks, you've got the marketing and sales people, the product development folks. I mean, and there are all these overlapping, intersecting, but at times competing interests here to balance. I had the chance 15 years ago on behalf of the US State Department, working together with the British Foreign Office, to put together what became the global human rights standard for oil and mining that still obtains. And I can tell you that one of the two biggest then and now the second largest US oil company, one of the still 5 so-called super major oil companies in the world, you can guess which one, extraordinary tensions within the company, whether they were going to embrace this initiative. I had, the people on the ground in the Niger Delta pleading with me to get this done because they needed guidance on how to deal with security forces in an active conflict zone. I had skeptics running the Nigeria operation out of Lagos and the secure compound there. I had people also pushing for it positively whose job was to work with the U.S. government out of Washington. And then I had skeptics in the corporate headquarters in the Bay Area. And then the legal people were at war with all the above who saw the issue strictly through a potential legal liability lens. So the point is that there's this incredible mosaic of factors and forces and functions and players. Just one other quick point I'm just going to make about rankings, and this is really important. if you step back and you look at the world of business and human rights, all the forces that have been driving now for 15, even 20 years, higher standards in various areas of different industries, particularly around human rights. You've got the campaigning NGOs, you've got the responsible investors, you've got governments that at times who have pushed, whether through legislative or regulatory mechanisms. You've got the media, and I would say not least the Guardian, really globally, at least in the English language, that does exposés sometimes in concert with NGOs in different areas. You've got standards that have emerged, either industry-specific ones or global generic ones, like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. My point to you is that these rankings have been emerging now the last several years as one of the real catalytic forces that are driving what, in my personal opinion, is positive change. Rebecca referred to the Access to Medicines Index. It's been around now 4 or 5 years. That has had a demonstrable impact on widening access to antiretrovirals to fight HIV, medicines around malaria, other diseases. You've got Oxfam's behind the brands, driven jointly by Oxfam Great Britain. Here, together with Oxfam America, I've been intimately involved in that. I'm a long-time member of the board of Oxfam America, and I can tell you that it has triggered a race to the top between some of the global food and beverage companies on certain issues, like between Coke and Pepsi, and I was privy to Oxfam's negotiations with both companies. In fact, part of them with Pepsi in particular, where you had Pepsi and Coke competing with each other to see how high a standard they could set in a new policy around land seizures, which is a big issue with their agricultural suppliers, and one of the key issues that Oxfam criticized both companies on. And now with RDR, we have a situation where, you know, Rebecca probably can't talk about this, but, you know, even before she launched 2 weeks ago in the consultation process with companies, there already were indications that they were going to try to improve their commitments down the road for the next iteration. Finally, there's an initiative I'm one of the drivers of internationally called the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark Initiative, which is going to rank the top 500 global companies in the world on a whole range of human rights factors, guiding principles, and more industry-specific ones. And I can tell you now, 2 years into the development of our methodology and a year into our consultations with companies and NGOs and investors, that already, even though we're not going to have our first pilot out until the third quarter of 2016, and even though this is a 5 to 10 year horizon we're driving toward, I can already see the ripples begin to spread out in different companies and industries who are girding themselves for the kind of attention, the spotlight we're going to bring to bear, and already for all the anxiety, it's having something of a positive catalytic effect. So these rankings matter, and we can't always achieve what we want through law. We can't always get it done through legislation or regulation or remedy in the courts. And this is an example of the kind of initiatives that could be taken externally that actually do set and raise standards and performance.
Thank you very much.
Great for journalists as well, you know, rankings. Oh, there's a number.
Yeah, exactly.
So